Montana Territory, 1872. Autumn tinted the rolling hills gold and crimson as Francis Everett guided his horse along the ridge overlooking the sprawling Falcon Creek Ranch. At 25, Francis had seen enough of life to know its hardships, but not enough to have lost his hope. The wind tousled his sandy brown hair as he surveyed the land that had called to him since he'd first laid eyes on it 3 months prior. A skilled ranch hand with calloused palms and a straight back, his lean, muscular frame had been shaped by years of breaking horses and driving cattle across unforgiving terrain. "Come on, Jasper," he murmured to his dun-colored stallion, urging him down the slope toward the ranch house. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and Francis knew he'd arrived just in time. Mr. Thornton had promised him work, and after drifting from ranch to ranch since the war ended, Francis was ready for something more permanent. But permanence meant vulnerability, and Francis had learned that lesson the hard way. The West takes more than it gives. His father had told him before a Comanche raid had taken both his parents when Francis was just 17. Since then, he'd kept to himself, avoiding attachments that would only end in loss. The frontier was no place for tender feelings, only survival, grit, and the next day's work. As he approached the ranch house, a small figure darted from the porch. A little girl no more than 8 years old with blonde pigtails bouncing as she ran to the fence. "Pa, Pa, a man's coming," she called over her shoulder while keeping her eyes fixed on Francis. A tall man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Emily, get back to the house now," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. The child reluctantly retreated to the porch, but remained watching with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Thornton?" Francis called, dismounting and extending his hand. "Francis Everett. I believe you're expecting me." James Thornton, owner of Falcon Creek, was a broad-shouldered man with graying temples and eyes that had seen their share of frontier hardship. "Indeed I am, Mr. Everett. Your timing couldn't be better. Winter's coming, and we're short-handed for the fall roundup. I'm grateful for the opportunity, sir. I won't let you down. Your reputation precedes you. Best horseman this side of the Rockies, they say." Thornton gestured toward the bunkhouse. "Get yourself settled. Supper's at sundown." As Francis led Jasper toward the corral, he felt a tug at his sleeve. Looking down, he found the little girl, Emily, staring up at him with solemn blue eyes. "Are you staying with us now, mister?" Francis couldn't help but smile. "Looks that way, little miss." "Good." She nodded decisively. "We need more good people. Ma says so." "Emily." A woman's voice called from the house, and Francis looked up to see a woman waving from the doorway. "Your ma's calling," Francis said gently. "That's not my ma. That's Mrs. Roberts, our housekeeper. My ma went to heaven when I was little." The child stated this with matter-of-fact acceptance. "Pa says she watches over us, though." Francis felt an unwelcome pang of sympathy. "I'm sure she does. Emily Thornton, I told you to leave Mr. Everett be." Mr. Thornton called, approaching them with an apologetic look. "Forgive my daughter, Everett. She's curious about everything and everyone." "No harm done, sir." As Thornton led his daughter away, Francis heard her stage whisper, "Pa, ask him to supper at our table instead of the bunkhouse. Please." Francis shook his head as he continued to the corral. Getting attached to the ranch owner's family would only complicate things. He'd learned long ago that keeping his distance was safer for everyone. This was just another job, nothing more. That evening, despite his intentions, Francis found himself seated at the Thornton family table rather than in the bunkhouse with the other hands. Emily had apparently worn her father down, and Thornton had extended the invitation with a hint of amusement in his eyes. "My daughter seems determined to make you feel welcome, Everett. I've learned it's sometimes easier to give in to her small requests than argue." The meal was simple but hearty: venison stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that Mrs. Roberts proudly announced she'd made that morning. Throughout the meal, Emily peppered Francis with questions about his travels, his horse, and whether he knew how to shoot a gun. "Emily, that's enough," her father finally interceded. "Mr. Everett didn't join us to be interrogated." Francis found himself surprisingly at ease. "It's all right, Mr. Thornton. Been a while since I've had such pleasant company at supper." Later, as Francis made his way to the bunkhouse under a blanket of stars, he reminded himself not to get too comfortable. The West had taught him that comfort preceded loss. Better to remain detached, do his job well, and move on when the time came. The ranch was beautiful, the Thorntons were kind, but attachment only made the inevitable goodbye harder. 3 weeks later, Frances had settled into the rhythm of ranch life. The fall roundup was in full swing, with cattle being gathered from the far reaches of Thornton's land. Frances had proven his worth many times over, breaking 2 horses deemed unrideable by the other hands and showing exceptional skill with the most stubborn cattle. One crisp morning, as frost sparkled on the grass, Thornton approached Frances as he saddled Jasper. "Everett, I need a favor. The schoolteacher in Silver Creek needs supplies delivered. Emily usually rides along when I make the trip. She's fond of Miss Sterling, but I can't spare the time today with the roundup. You want me to take the supplies instead?" Frances asked, already anticipating the answer. "And Emily, if you're willing. She'll be heartbroken to miss the visit, and Mrs. Roberts can't ride due to her arthritis." Frances hesitated. A day spent with a chatty 8-year-old wasn't what he'd planned, but refusing seemed ungrateful after the kindness Thornton had shown him. "Of course, sir. I'd be happy to." 2 hours later, Frances found himself driving a wagon into Silver Creek with Emily perched beside him, talking endlessly about Miss Sterling, the schoolteacher she clearly adored. "She has the prettiest blue eyes and hair like sunshine, and she knows everything about everything," Emily declared. "She came all the way from Boston last year. Pa says she's too refined for Silver Creek, but I think she's perfect." Frances smiled despite himself. "She sounds impressive." "She is. And she's not married, not even a little bit," Emily added with peculiar emphasis that Frances chose to ignore. Silver Creek was a modest settlement, one main street with the essential businesses of frontier life. The schoolhouse sat at the far end, a small white building with a bell tower. As they approached, a slender woman in a pale blue dress emerged onto the porch. "Miss Sterling, Miss Sterling," Emily called, waving frantically as Frances brought the wagon to a halt. Frances felt his breath catch as the schoolteacher smiled. She was perhaps 22, with golden blonde hair pulled back in a simple chignon and bright blue eyes that seemed to capture the entire sky. Her dress, though simple, was well-tailored, revealing a grace that indeed seemed out of place in this rough-hewn town. "Emily Thornton, what a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, her voice carrying a refined Eastern accent that confirmed Emily's story. As she approached the wagon, her eyes met Frances's, and something inside him stirred uncomfortably. "This is Mr. Francis Everett," Emily announced proudly. "He works for Pa now, and he's the best horse rider in all of Montana. Mr. Everett, this is Miss Sophia Sterling." Francis removed his hat. "Ma'am." "Mr. Everett," Sophia replied with a small curtsy. "Thank you for bringing Emily. And the supplies, of course." Her smile was warm, her manner dignified yet approachable. "Just doing as Mr. Thornton asked, ma'am." As they unloaded the supplies, books, paper, pencils, and some personal items for Miss Sterling, Emily darted into the schoolhouse, declaring she wanted to see if anything had changed since Friday. "She's your most enthusiastic student, I gather," Frances said, breaking the awkward silence. Sophia laughed, a musical sound that seemed to brighten the autumn air. "Emily sees the world as an endless adventure. I'm trying to nurture that while also teaching her that 7 times 8 is 56. A worthy challenge." Francis found himself smiling. "You're not from these parts originally? Is my accent that obvious?" Sophia asked, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "No, I came from Boston last year. My father was a professor, and after he passed, I decided I needed a change. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Montana Territory, it seemed like Providence." "That's quite a change from Boston society." "It was an adjustment," she admitted. "But these children deserve an education as much as any in the East. Perhaps more so, given the challenges they'll face." Her conviction was evident in her steady gaze. Before Frances could respond, Emily burst from the schoolhouse. "Miss Sterling, can Mr. Everett see our map project? Please." And so Francis found himself touring the one-room schoolhouse, admiring hand-drawn maps of the United States and listening to Sophia explain her teaching methods with passion and intelligence. Something about her earnestness, her dedication to these frontier children, touched something in Francis he thought long buried. "You've created something special here," he said quietly as Emily explored the bookshelf. "These children are fortunate." "Thank you, Mr. Everett." Sophia's eyes held his for a moment too long, causing him to look away. "We should be getting back," he said abruptly. "Mr. Thornton will be expecting us." As they prepared to leave, Emily suddenly announced, "Miss Sterling should come for Sunday dinner. Can she, Mr. Everett? Please." Before Francis could explain it wasn't his place to extend such invitations, Sophia intervened. "That's for your father to decide, Emily. But thank you for thinking of me. Pa always says you're welcome anytime," Emily insisted. "Doesn't he, Mr. Everett?" Put on the spot, Francis nodded. "Mr. Thornton does seem hospitable." "Then it's settled," Emily declared triumphantly. "Sunday dinner at our house." On the wagon ride back to the ranch, Emily was unusually quiet until they were halfway home. Then, as if making an important announcement, she stated, "She's the one." Francis glanced at her, confused. "Who's what now?" "Miss Sterling. She's the one for you." Emily nodded decisively. Francis nearly pulled the wagon to a halt. "What are you talking about, Emily?" "The way you looked at her. Like Pa used to look at Ma in the pictures." She spoke with absolute certainty. "And she looked at you the same way." "Emily," Francis said firmly, "adults don't decide things that way. Miss Sterling and I just met, and besides, I'm not looking to." "You don't have to be looking," Emily interrupted with the wisdom of a child. "Sometimes the right person finds you anyway. That's what Mrs. Roberts says." Francis shook his head, determined to end this line of conversation. "Let's talk about something else. How about you tell me about your schoolwork?" But Emily's words lingered in his mind as they continued toward home. The idea was absurd, of course. Francis Everett wasn't looking for love or companionship. The frontier had taught him that such attachments were luxuries he couldn't afford. And yet, he couldn't deny the strange feeling that had come over him when Sophia Sterling smiled. Sunday arrived clear and cool, with the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air. Francis had spent the week trying to forget about the schoolteacher with the sky-blue eyes, throwing himself into work with unusual intensity. He'd volunteered for the furthest pastures, the earliest shifts, anything to exhaust himself beyond the capacity for thought. And yet, as he washed up for dinner, he found himself taking extra care with his appearance, trimming his stubble and donning his one good shirt. He told himself it was simply respect for Thornton's hospitality, nothing more. When Sophia arrived in a modest carriage driven by the town's liveryman, Francis was inexplicably near the front gate. He offered his hand to help her down, feeling an unexpected jolt when her fingers clasped his. "Thank you, Mr. Everett," she said, her cheeks slightly flushed from the cool air. She wore a dark green dress that complemented her fair complexion and brought out flecks of green in her blue eyes. "My pleasure, Miss Sterling." Emily came bounding down the path. "You came. I told Pa you would. Come see. I've set the table special." Dinner was a lively affair. Thornton proved an amiable host, drawing out stories of Sophia's life in Boston and her journey west. Francis found himself entranced by her tales of crossing the country alone, her determination to make a difference in this remote territory. "Weren't you afraid?" he asked during a lull in the conversation. "A woman traveling alone through such dangerous country?" Sophia considered his question thoughtfully. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But sometimes fear must be faced if we're to find where we truly belong." Her gaze met his. "Don't you agree, Mr. Everett?" The question caught him off guard. "I suppose some might. But not you." Her perception was unsettling. "I found it safer to accept the world as it is rather than hope for what it might be," he replied carefully. "Even if accepting means missing what could be." Her voice was gentle, not challenging but curious. Before Francis could answer, Emily interjected. "Miss Sterling plays the piano beautifully. Pa, can she play for us after dinner?" The moment passed, but Francis felt as though Sophia had somehow seen straight through the careful walls he'd built around himself. It was disconcerting, like having a stranger recognize you in a town you've never visited. After dinner, Sophia did indeed play the small piano in the Thornton parlor. Her skilled fingers brought forth melodies that seemed to transport them all away from the frontier to grand concert halls and civilized gatherings. Francis watched her from across the room, noting how the lamplight caught in her hair, how her expression softened as she lost herself in the music. When she finished a particularly moving piece, their eyes met across the room. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that left Francis both unsettled and inexplicably hopeful. Later, as he prepared to drive Sophia back to town, Emily pulled him aside. "Remember what I told you?" she whispered with childish insistence. "She's the one. I can tell." The ride to Silver Creek was quiet at first, the night sky brilliant with stars above them. Francis found himself searching for words, unusual for a man comfortable with silence. "You play beautifully," he finally said. "Thank you. Music was my mother's passion before she passed. She taught me from the time I could reach the keys." Sophia's voice was soft in the darkness. "I miss it sometimes. The schoolhouse has no piano. It seems a waste of your talent out here. Is that what you think of the West? That it wastes what's refined or gentle?" Francis considered this. The frontier isn't kind to softness. Perhaps, or perhaps softness is exactly what the frontier needs to become more than just a harsh wilderness. She turned slightly toward him. "What brought you west, Mr. Everett?" "Nothing brought me. Something drove me." The words emerged before he could stop them. "Indian raid. I was 17. My parents didn't survive." "I'm sorry," she said simply, without the usual platitudes. "It was a long time ago. And you've been wandering since?" "Moving on. There's a difference." "Is there?" Sophia asked quietly. "Moving towards something or away from something. It matters, doesn't it?" They had reached her modest cabin at the edge of town. Francis helped her down from the wagon, acutely aware of her nearness, the scent of lavender that seemed to surround her. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Everett," she said, lingering by the gate. "Francis," he said suddenly. "My name is Francis." Her smile in the moonlight was worth the momentary vulnerability. "Thank you, Francis. I'm Sophia." She hesitated, then added, "Perhaps you might escort Emily to school again sometime? The journey can be educational." "Perhaps I might," he agreed, surprising himself. As he drove back to the ranch under the vast Montana sky, Francis tried to dismiss the warm feeling in his chest. It was foolishness, this sudden interest in a schoolteacher who clearly belonged in more civilized surroundings. She would eventually realize her mistake in coming west, return to the east where she belonged. Attachment would only lead to disappointment. And yet, Emily's words echoed in his mind. She's the one. Ridiculous, of course. Francis Everett wasn't looking for anyone. He'd learned that lesson years ago. The West took what you loved. Better not to love at all. Over the next month, Francis found himself volunteering whenever supplies needed delivery to Silver Creek. Each visit deepened his fascination with Sophia Sterling. He would arrive with the pretense of checking the schoolhouse roof or fixing a stubborn window, staying to listen as she taught her students about distant lands and mathematical principles. The children had accepted his presence with casual curiosity that evolved into expectation. "Mr. Everett's here again," they would announce without surprise, making room for him on the bench at the back of the classroom. One afternoon in late November, as the first snow began to fall, Francis arrived to find Sophia alone in the schoolhouse, grading papers by lamplight. The students had been dismissed early due to the weather. "Francis," she said, looking up with evident pleasure. "I wasn't expecting you today. Mr. Thornton was concerned about the snow. Thought I should check if you needed anything before the roads become difficult." That was thoughtful of him. Her knowing smile suggested she understood the excuse for what it was. Francis removed his hat, suddenly uncertain of himself. "I can come back another time if you're busy." "Not at all. I could use the company, actually." She gestured to the chair beside her desk. "Unless you need to hurry back?" He should say yes, should cite the impending storm and make his excuses. Instead, he found himself settling into the offered chair. "I have time." They talked as the snow fell steadily outside, creating a cocoon of warmth and intimacy within the schoolhouse. Sophia spoke of her dreams for her students, her hope that education might give them choices beyond the limited horizons of frontier life. Francis found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone about his parents, his years of drifting, the emptiness that had become so familiar he hardly noticed it anymore. "You've been running," Sophia observed gently. "Not just moving on." "Maybe," he conceded. "Does it matter?" "It matters if you're running from happiness as well as pain." Her directness was disarming. "The frontier can be harsh, Francis, but it doesn't have to be lonely." The snow was falling heavily now, the wind picking up. Francis reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back before this gets worse." Sophia nodded, but as she walked him to the door, she impulsively caught his hand. "Thank you for coming today. Your visits mean a great deal to me." The touch of her hand, warm and soft against his weathered palm, sent an electric current through him. For one breathless moment, he considered pulling her close, discovering if her lips were as soft as they appeared. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand before releasing it. "Take care, Sophia. I'll check on you after the storm passes." The blizzard that followed was the worst in recent memory, confining everyone to their homes for 3 days. Francis found himself pacing the bunkhouse, worrying about Sophia alone in her cabin. Had she enough firewood? Food? What if something happened and no one could reach her? On the 4th day, as soon as the path to town was barely passable, Francis saddled Jasper despite Thornton's warnings about the dangerous conditions. "Miss Sterling might need assistance," was all he said by way of explanation. The journey was treacherous. The snow drifted higher than Jasper's knees in places. What should have been a 1-hour ride took nearly 3. By the time Francis reached Sophia's cabin, his concern had grown to genuine fear. There was no smoke coming from her chimney. Heart pounding, he dismounted and trudged through the snow to her door, calling her name. When there was no answer, he tried the handle, locked, then circled to the window. The interior was dark and still. Making a decision, Francis broke the window, reached in to unlock it, and climbed through. The cabin was freezing, the fireplace cold. "Sophia," he called, real panic rising now. A weak cough from the bedroom answered him. He found her huddled beneath every blanket she owned, her face flushed with fever, her breathing labored. "Francis," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I knew you'd come." "You're burning up," he said, touching her forehead. "How long have you been like this?" "Since yesterday, I think. The fire went out, couldn't get more wood." She coughed again, the sound rattling in her chest. Without hesitation, Francis set to work. He built a fire, melted snow for water, and found her small store of medicinal supplies. As the cabin slowly warmed, he coaxed her to drink water and take the willow bark tea he prepared from her supplies. Hour after hour, he sat beside her, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, supporting her when coughing fits racked her body. As night fell, he knew he couldn't leave her. He dragged the small settee next to her bed and settled in for a vigil, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Don't leave," she murmured once, her fingers tightening around his. "I won't," he promised, and meant it in ways that terrified him. By morning, her fever had broken. She woke to find Francis asleep in the uncomfortable settee, still holding her hand. The sight of him there, his face softened in sleep, his strong fingers gentle around hers, brought tears to her eyes. "Francis," she whispered. He woke instantly, alert. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better." She struggled to sit up, and he was immediately there, supporting her. "You stayed all night." "Of course I did." The words were simple, but his eyes conveyed everything he couldn't say. "You could have died coming through that snow." His hand moved to her cheek, an unconscious gesture of tenderness. "You could have died alone in this cabin." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken feelings. Then Francis abruptly stood. "You need food. Something substantial. I'll make breakfast." As he busied himself in her small kitchen, Sophia watched him, understanding dawning. This man who claimed to want no attachments had risked his life to reach her. The realization warmed her more than the fire he had built. After ensuring Sophia was recovering and had sufficient supplies, Francis reluctantly prepared to leave. The weather had improved slightly, and he needed to let Thornton know what had happened. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "Sooner if the weather holds." "Francis," Sophia said as he reached the door. "Thank you, not just for last night, but for finding me in the first place." He understood she meant more than her fever. "I wasn't looking," he admitted. "Sometimes," she said with a small smile, "we find what we need before we know we're searching for it." The ride back to Falcon Creek gave Francis time to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Sophia Sterling had become important to him, too important. The prospect of losing her to illness had revealed how deeply she had worked her way into his heart. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. When he returned to the ranch, Emily was the first to greet him, running to the corral as he dismounted. "Did you find Miss Sterling? Is she all right? Pa was worried about you both." "She had a bad fever, but she's recovering now," Francis explained, touched by the child's concern. Emily nodded solemnly. "I told Pa you'd find her. I said you'd take care of her because she's the one." "Emily," Francis began, But the child had already darted off to share the news with her father. Thornton was more pragmatic, but no less relieved. That was a foolhardy journey, Everett, but I'm glad you made it. Miss Sterling is well respected in these parts. Would have been a terrible loss. Yes, sir. It would have been. The inadequacy of these words to describe what Sophia meant to him was almost painful. Take whatever supplies you need when you return tomorrow, Thornton added, his knowing expression suggesting he understood more than Frances had revealed. And Everett, don't rush back if she needs looking after. Over the next week, Frances spent every day at Sophia's cabin, returning to the ranch only to sleep. He chopped a winter's worth of firewood, repaired her roof, and ensured her pantry was stocked against future storms. As her strength returned, their conversations deepened, revealing a compatibility that went beyond their obvious attraction. One evening, as they sat before her fire sharing stories of their childhoods, Sophia asked the question Frances had been dreading. Will you leave when spring comes? He stared into the flames, unable to meet her gaze. I've never stayed in one place more than a season or two. That's not an answer. I don't know, he admitted finally. I've never had a reason to stay before. And now? Her voice was steady, but he could hear the vulnerability beneath. Frances finally looked at her, seeing the future he both longed for and feared reflected in her eyes. Now I'm afraid of wanting to stay. Afraid of what it would mean to put down roots, to care that deeply. Because the frontier takes what you love, she said, showing she had understood his unspoken fear all along. Frances, that's true anywhere. Boston or Montana, loving means risking loss. The question is whether the joy is worth the risk. He reached for her hand, marveling at how it fit perfectly in his. With you? I'm beginning to think it might be. As Christmas approached, the entire territory prepared for the holiday despite the harsh winter. The Thornton Ranch would host a celebration for neighbors from miles around, and Sophia had been invited to stay at the ranch for the week of festivities. The night before the gathering, Frances found himself alone with Thornton on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear, cold sky. You've changed since you came here, Everett, Thornton observed, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Sir, there's a purpose to you now. A man looks different when he's found something worth fighting for. Frances couldn't deny it. Miss Sterling is, unlike anyone I've known. Thornton nodded. She reminds me of my Catherine. Same spirit, same gentleness with steel beneath. I recognized it the moment she arrived in Silver Creek. He paused, studying Frances. A woman like that deserves certainty, Everett. She deserves a man who's done running. I know, Frances said quietly. I'm trying to be that man. Good. Thornton clapped him on the shoulder. Because my daughter seems convinced you're meant for each other, and Emily can be remarkably stubborn when she's set her mind to something. The Christmas gathering filled the ranch house with warmth and laughter. Neighbors who lived in isolation most of the year embraced the rare opportunity for community. Sophia, wearing a red dress that brought color to her cheeks, was the center of attention as parents thanked her for her dedication to their children's education. Frances watched her from across the room, struck anew by her grace, her easy way with everyone from the gruffest rancher to the shyest child. When their eyes met over the crowd, the connection between them was almost palpable. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Frances found Sophia standing alone on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky. Cold night to be stargazing, he said, joining her. The stars seemed closer out here than they ever did in Boston. She turned to him, her expression earnest in the moonlight. I never expected to find a home here, Frances. I thought I was just escaping grief, running from memories. But this place, these people, she hesitated. You. It's all become so dear to me. The emotion in her voice touched him deeply. Without thinking, he stepped closer, drawing her into his arms. Sophia, he whispered, and then he was kissing her, pouring years of loneliness and newfound hope into the gentle press of his lips against hers. She responded with equal fervor, her hands moving to his face as if to assure herself he was real. When they finally parted, both breathless, she smiled up at him. I was beginning to think you'd never do that. I was beginning to think the same thing, he admitted with a soft laugh. The sound of a throat clearing interrupted them. They turned to find Emily standing in the doorway, a triumphant grin on her small face. I knew it, she declared before disappearing back into the house. Despite the development in their relationship, Francis still struggled with his deep-seated fears. He and Sophia had begun courting openly, with Thornton's blessing, but as winter gave way to the first hints of spring, a restlessness stirred in Francis that he couldn't entirely suppress. The turning point came unexpectedly in early March. Francis had ridden to a far corner of Thornton's property to check on a line of fencing when he heard gunshots in the distance. Instinctively, he turned Jasper toward the sound, riding hard through melting snow and mud. He crested a hill to find a horrifying scene. Sophia's school wagon surrounded by 3 mounted men, clearly outlaws from their appearance. The children were huddled inside the wagon while Sophia stood before them, a small derringer in her shaking hand as she faced down the bandits. "That's far enough," she was saying, her voice remarkably steady. "There's nothing of value here. Just children and books." The leader of the group laughed. "Pretty schoolmarm like you is valuable enough." Before Francis could intervene, one of the men noticed him and shouted a warning. The leader turned, drawing his revolver with practiced speed. Francis had only seconds to react. He flung himself from Jasper's back as the outlaw's bullet whistled past his ear. Rolling to his feet, Francis drew his own gun and fired in one fluid motion. The leader cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell from his horse. The other 2 outlaws returned fire, forcing Francis to dive for cover behind a boulder. What followed was the most terrifying minutes of Francis's life. Pinned down and outnumbered, he could see Sophia urging the children to lie flat in the wagon while she crouched beside it, still gripping her small gun with determination. When one of the bandits circled toward the wagon, clearly intending to use the children as leverage, something inside Francis snapped. This was everything he had feared, the people he loved in mortal danger. And yet in that moment, fear gave way to absolute clarity. These were his to protect. Sophia, the children, this land, this life he had begun to build. With a roar of defiance, Francis broke cover, firing with deadly accuracy. The outlaw threatening the children fell, and the remaining bandit, seeing the tide turn, fled into the woods. The injured leader attempted to mount his horse but collapsed in the attempt. In the sudden silence, Francis ran to the wagon. "Is everyone all right?" "Sophia." She emerged from behind the wagon, pale but composed. "We're unharmed. The children are frightened but safe." She surveyed the scene, her gaze falling on the wounded outlaw. "He needs a doctor." "He needs to be locked up," Francis corrected, though he was already moving to bind the man's wound. "What were you doing out here?" "School should have been over hours ago." "Nature study," she explained, helping a tearful little girl from the wagon. "We were collecting early spring flowers when these men appeared." As Francis secured the outlaws, one dead, one wounded and bound, Sophia gathered the children, speaking softly to reassure them. Her courage, her composure in the face of danger, struck Francis with the force of revelation. He had spent years believing that loving meant inevitable loss, that the frontier would take whatever he dared to cherish. Yet here was Sophia, who had faced down armed men to protect her students, who had built a life of purpose in this harsh land, who had opened her heart to him despite the risks. That evening, after the children had been returned to their parents and the surviving outlaws handed over to the sheriff, Francis and Sophia sat together on the porch of her cabin. The events of the day had left them both drained but strangely exhilarated, bound together by shared danger and survival. "You could have been killed," Sophia said quietly, her hand finding his in the gathering darkness. "So could you," he replied. "You stood your ground against those men. I've seen hardened cowboys show less courage. I couldn't let them harm the children." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "Francis, today made me realize something. The frontier is dangerous. Always has been, always will be. But that danger doesn't mean we shouldn't love, shouldn't build something worth protecting." Her words echoed his own revelation. "I've been afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I allowed myself to care too deeply, to put down roots, I'd only be setting myself up for greater loss. But today, when I saw you in danger," he paused, searching for words, "I realized the fear of losing you was nothing compared to the fear of never having truly had you in my life at all." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying, Francis?" He took both her hands in his heart pounding, but his purpose unwavering. "I'm saying I love you, Sophia Sterling. I'm saying I want to stop running, to build a life here, with you. Are you certain? She asked, hope and caution warring in her expression. The West is in your blood. I wouldn't want to be the reason you feel trapped. I've never been more certain of anything, he assured her. The West is vast, but it's empty without someone to share it with. You've shown me that a home isn't a place to hide from the world, but a foundation from which to face it, together. Her smile was radiant as she leaned forward to kiss him, a promise and a seal to the future they would build. 2 weeks later, Frances stood beside James Thornton in the ranch's main pasture, surveying a stretch of land that sloped gently toward a creek. It's good land, Thornton was saying. The best on the property for a home site. Well-watered, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. A man could build something substantial here. Frances nodded, envisioning the possibilities. It's generous of you to offer it. Not just offering, Everett. It would be part of your stake in the ranch. Thornton turned to face him directly. I've been watching you these past months. You have a gift with horses, an instinct for the land. I'm not getting any younger, and Emily needs more family around her than just an aging father. Sir, Frances wasn't sure he understood. I'm proposing a partnership. You'd start with a small share, build up over time. Eventually, when I'm too old to manage things, you'd take over the running of Falcon Creek. With Sophia by your side, of course. A proper family operation. The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. Mr. Thornton, I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it. Thornton smiled. Though from what Emily tells me, you and Miss Sterling have already been discussing your future. It was true. Since the encounter with the outlaws, Frances and Sophia had spent every available moment planning their life together. She would continue teaching, but they had dreams of eventually starting a school on the ranch itself, open to all the children in the region. I'll more than consider it, Frances said firmly. I accept, with gratitude and a promise to be worthy of your trust. Thornton extended his hand, and as they shook on the agreement, Frances felt the last of his wanderlust fade, replaced by something stronger, the desire to build, to grow, to create a legacy. There's one condition, Thornton added with a twinkle in his eye. You have to tell Emily she was right all along. She's been insufferably smug about predicting your match with Miss Sterling. Frances laughed. I can live with that. By early May, the land had fully awakened from winter's grip. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and new calves wobbled alongside their mothers. On a perfect Saturday morning, with the mountains crisp against a cloudless sky, the entire community gathered at Falcon Creek Ranch to witness the wedding of Frances Everett and Sophia Sterling. A simple altar had been erected beneath a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. Lanterns hung from the branches, unnecessary in the bright spring sunshine, but ready for the celebration that would continue into the evening. Chairs borrowed from the schoolhouse and neighboring ranches formed rows on the fresh grass. Frances stood beside the preacher, Thornton serving as his best man, watching as Emily preceded Sophia down the makeshift aisle, scattering wildflower petals with joyful abandon. And then Sophia appeared in a gown of ivory silk, her golden hair adorned with a wreath of spring blossoms, her eyes never leaving Frances's as she walked toward him. In that moment, as they joined hands before their friends and neighbors, Frances realized how far he had come from the solitary drifter who had arrived at Falcon Creek Ranch less than a year earlier. The man who had believed the frontier took more than it gave had found, instead, that it offered the greatest gift of all, a chance to build something lasting from nothing but courage and love. As they spoke their vows, Frances's voice was clear and certain. The fear that had defined his existence for so long had been transformed into a different kind of awareness. Not that love meant inevitable loss, but that love made the risk worthwhile. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared, and as Frances kissed his bride, cheers erupted from the assembled community. At the celebration that followed, with music and dancing lasting well into the night, Emily found a moment to tug at Frances's sleeve, pulling him away from the well-wishers. Are you happy you listened to me? She asked, her expression earnest beneath the festive paper crown she wore. Frances knelt to her level, smiling at the child who would now be his stepdaughter in all but name. More grateful than I can say, Emily. How did you know? That first day, when you said Miss Sterling was the one. How could you possibly have known? Emily shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. Because you looked sad, like you were missing something you didn't know was gone. And Miss Sterling looked the same way. I figured maybe you were missing each other. From the simple wisdom of a child had come the truth that had changed Frances's life. He hugged her tightly. You're a remarkable young lady, Emily Thornton. Emily Thornton Everett now, she corrected with a grin. That's what Pa says I can be called if I want. Because we're all family now. Yes, we are, Frances agreed, his heart full as he watched Sophia approach, her face glowing with happiness. One family, built right here on the frontier. As summer turned to autumn, Frances and Sophia settled into their new home, a sturdy cabin built on the land Thornton had offered. The foundation for a larger house had been laid nearby, a project for the coming years as their family grew. Sophia continued teaching, though now she rode to town with Frances each morning, returning together each afternoon to their shared life. One evening in late September, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Sophia rested her head on Frances's shoulder with a contented sigh. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The wandering life? Frances considered the question honestly. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it. No responsibilities beyond myself, no ties to worry about. He kissed the top of her head. But I wouldn't trade what I have now for all the freedom in the world. And what is it you have now, Mr. Everett? She asked teasingly. He turned to face her, taking in the beauty of her face, still flushed from the day's activities, her blue eyes bright with love and mischief. A home, a purpose, a partnership with a remarkable woman, a future worth building. His hand moved to rest gently on her stomach, where the first signs of their child had begun to show. A family. Sophia covered his hand with hers. When I came west, I thought I was just escaping grief. I never imagined I would find everything I never knew I was looking for. Emily knew, Frances said with a smile. She told me you were the one before I even realized I was looking. Wise beyond her years, that one. Sophia leaned up to kiss him softly. I'm glad you listened. As darkness settled over the Montana landscape, Frances Everett held his wife close, marveling at how the frontier, which he had once believed took more than it gave, had given him everything: love, family, purpose, home. The man who had spent years running from attachment had found, at last, that in the right arms, with the right heart beside him, there was nowhere left he needed to go. Emily had been right all along. Sophia was the one, and in finding her, Frances had found himself as well.